Hi everyone, my name is Keizigler. I am the Vice Chair of the Stakeholder Advisory Committee for Region 2. I am here tonight to kick off our meeting. So to start us off, I'd like to go ahead and have a motion to approve our agenda first. Can I hear somebody for the committee? Is that a yes? First, anybody second it? Okay. No opposition? Okay, hearing none, it's approved. Second, we'll go ahead and move to approve our meeting minutes from our last meeting, last month. Do I have somebody motion to approve that? Okay. Any second? Any opposition? All right, hearing none, we'll move forward. All right, so to kick us off today, I wanted to first start off by saying a sincere thank you to all of my Stakeholder Advisory Committee members. I know that you all are making a lot of effort to get here, especially after work in the middle of the week in traffic. Really do appreciate all of your efforts, your thoughtful comments, as well as your questions. So for tonight, we are looking forward to hearing from our subject matter experts related to the very important topic, of course, housing. We will hear from, of course, members of the county, as well as different organizations and HOA. So moving forward, after we actually hear from the presentations, we'll have opportunities for the Stakeholder Advisory Committee members to ask for questions of our subject matter experts. We'll have an exercise, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. All right, with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sherry and Mark to go ahead and kick us off.
Thank you. And this mic goes to Zoom, so if you're wondering why my voice, you can't hear me better, that's why. I just want to thank our panelists for being here. I'll introduce them in a minute, and then I'm going to just review quickly the structure for the meeting. So like Keisha said, presentations and a question and answer session led by the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. We have the benefit this time of going third of all of the regions. So what we've learned from the previous meetings is that the conversations with the panelists have been very excellent. We anticipate being able to get to our Plan 2040 housing strategy review, but I want to ask the SAC members to be flexible, because if the conversation is still going and there's still a lot to talk about, we may postpone that activity or part of that activity. In the event that we are able to get to it, I know you all spent time with Plan 2040 prior to this. We have printed out the most relevant, all the strategies are relevant, but the most relevant to housing for the region plans. Those strategies are printed out and posted around the room. So part of the activity is going to involve you during the break, reviewing the strategies, using the Post-it notes to ask questions or to make comments on the strategies and how you could foresee them being actionable in your neighborhood. We've also given each of you a limited number of dots. You could use those dots to indicate the things that you really want to talk about. If we've got 10 minutes to talk as a group, we're going to focus on the strategies that have the most dots. So use your own approach to this. You could put all your dots on one strategy if that's really important to you, or you could spread them out, do one vote per strategy. For anything that we don't manage to get to today, either with Plan 2040 or if there are outstanding questions that the SAC have, Mark and I will make opportunities for you to follow up with us, and we'll continue to forward those questions to the panel afterwards. So don't worry if we aren't able to address everything. So with that said, I just want to introduce, I'll just say who all's here and then hand it over to them to get started. So first, we're joined by Dan Pontius, who's the Housing Policy Coordinator for Baltimore Metropolitan Council. We've got Karen McJunkin, who's the Vice President of Elm Street Communities. We have Aaron Karpowitz, who is the Executive Director of Arundel Community Development Services. Steve Keizigler, who's our own administrator, or I guess officer of the Office of Planning and Zoning. A badge. We're also supported by a few other staff here from throughout the county. So we have the Deputy Director of the Office of Planning and Zoning, Christina Pompa. We have the Zoning Administrator, Sterling Say. The Director of Long Range Planning, so me and Mark's boss, Cindy Carrier. And then we're joined by Joe Griffiths as well from the Maryland Department of Planning. So you've got a lot of good brain trust and you're in good hands. And now I'm going to pass it over to Dan to kick us off with his presentation.
Oh, sorry, just a quick reminder to say your name into the microphone beforehand for us. Sure. I'm Dan Pontius. I'm the Housing Policy Coordinator at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. And I'm going to start out at kind of the 30,000 foot level, and we're going to kind of work our way down, I think, to the county and to your part of the county. So if you want to run to the next slide, just a little bit on BMC, the Baltimore Metropolitan Council. We are a regional group. We you can see all the different jurisdictions. We work with Baltimore City and the 6 surrounding counties in the region, primarily on transportation planning. Regional transportation planning is necessary to receive federal transportation funds, and we do air quality planning through that too. But we also do cooperative purchasing, where the counties can get a better price on electricity and school supplies and things like that by pooling our purchasing power. And then I'm the housing person, so I staff a housing committee of local jurisdictions and private stakeholders. We meet monthly to talk about key issues facing the region. I've facilitated a lot of information sharing around the rental assistance programs during the pandemic, because Anne Arundel County and every other county had to basically create those from scratch, and we're learning from each other as we went along. And then I help Anne Arundel County and the other local jurisdictions carry out their duty to affirmatively for further fair housing under the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So if you want to run to the next slide, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context in terms of the housing market in the region, which you've probably heard. This is probably things you've heard before. One of the pandemic surprises was how much demand there was for purchasing houses and how much pressure that put on the housing market. Well, the Baltimore region is no exception to that. This little graph is the green line is 2020, and then the blue line is 2021. So housing prices just kept going up and up. If you go to the next slide, you can see this wasn't just a pandemic phenomenon. That's a headline from the Capitol from 2017 about an inventory squeeze here in Anne Arundel County. And then that graph at the bottom goes back to, I believe, June 2017. And it shows, year over year increases of 5, 10, even 15%. So, you get like 5 or 6 years of that, and you've got home prices that are a lot higher than they used to be. So if you go to the next slide. And so, that's great if you already own your house and you want to have a down payment for your next house, or sell and retire or something like that. But it's not so great for people who want to enter homeownership for the first time. And for renter, there are people who are kind of stuck because of these high home prices in renting. And so then that's putting pressure on rents. So this is a article from the Washington Post from the spring up in the upper right, and then the map shows that over the last 2 years, rents have gone up about 15% in Anne Arundel County, some of the higher rent increases in the broader region. So if you want to go to the next slide, and then this is where we've really been getting into this, because from a fair housing analysis we did a couple of years ago, these sort of stubborn racial home ownership gaps really stood out to us. And there's been more attention to this nationally too. I mean, literally since the Fair Housing Act really opened up home ownership to African Americans, the gap between non-Hispanic white people and African Americans hasn't really budged in 50 years. And then if you go to the next slide too, this is a slide from a graph from our fair housing analysis. You see each jurisdiction in the Baltimore region has that same gap, with 80% of non-Hispanic white people in Anne Arundel County owning their own home, but only 51% of African Americans owning their own home. And so anyway, so if you go to the next slide, so we've been really looking into that. We've been talking to homeownership counselors in the region at Aaron's agency and all around the region whose jobs are to help people get into homeownership for the first time. And one of the themes we started hearing was just the lack of homes available at a price that people could afford. And so this idea of lack of inventory, kind of a shortage of housing, has been getting a lot of national attention too. So here's just a few headlines from the last few months, frankly. And although the top one is from a Freddie Mac analysis back in early 2020, even before the pandemic, there was a sense that there's a shortage of homes, and then the pandemic demand has just even increased that. And so, and people are, we've kind of been here, like, the mid 2000s, you saw this huge increase in real estate values. But there you had just banks lending all over the place, lots of banks lending at subprime rates, huge, big interest rates. But basically anybody could get a mortgage, and then the investors and banks kept buying up those mortgages and bundling them. And then when people couldn't pay their mortgage anymore, there was this big crash. So the real estate market was overvalued. But that's not the case now. It's still not that easy to get a mortgage. And now we've got the Fed raising interest rates to try to dampen this pressure, because these rising housing rates are a big part of inflation too. So it's not super easy to get a mortgage. And so the consensus nationally is that we just don't. This is just supply and demand. There's a lot of demand out there. There's an increasing population, and we're just not increasing the supply of housing at a rate that can keep prices moderate. So if you run, the Washington region was ahead of us really in looking at this. Obviously, there's more real estate pressure there. And I kind of stole this idea from Montgomery County, which did a presentation to us last fall about how they realized that they just haven't been building homes at a rate that they used to. And so one of the things we do at BMC is we track building permits all the way back. This is not so great. I mean, this goes back to 1965. That's that left bar, and then 2020 is the right bar. So that's 55 years of housing permits. The taller orange bars are the whole metropolitan area, and then the shorter blue bars are Anne Arundel County. And so, between 1965 and 2000, we were building almost 15,000 homes a year, and this is both multifamily and home ownership, single family homes. It's units, so it's housing units. So, and then between 2000 and 2020, that dropped about 45% to just below 8,000 units per year. So if you go to the next slide, it just kind of summarizes those numbers. So that's a 46% reduction region-wide. And then the numbers in Anne Arundel County are similar, dropped from about 3,500 units a year to just over 2,100. It's like nearly a 40% reduction in units produced too. So that Freddie Mac study that I showed you a few slides ago estimates that Maryland's shortage is a little over 3% of our existing inventory. And if you prorate that for the Baltimore region, that means we're just under 40,000 units short of what we need to really supply the homes for everybody who wants to buy a house and form a separate, live here to work here and form a separate household and things like that. So we're going to we're at the very beginning stages of looking at this, but I just wanted to give you that sort of context of the housing market here in the region and how that's probably affecting Anne Arundel County too. And so I think I turn it over to Karen.
Great, so I'll move into mine. My name is Karen McJunkin, a regional partner with Elm Street Communities. I've been developing in Anne Arundel County and in the region for a little over 30 years, developing primarily residential and some mixed use as well. My focus today will be on discussing the Anne Arundel County for sale new construction housing market from both a supply and a demand perspective. And at the end, I'll throw out some ideas that other jurisdictions in the region have implemented to try and solve some of the same issues that Anne Arundel County is facing in terms of housing. Dan started us off with statistics that show there's a housing shortage. I'm gonna drill down and get a little more granular and talk about what is being built in the market and why. And so we'll start with the supply side. Our area in Anne Arundel County, like most of the rest of the region, is dominated by national production builders. The primary reason for this is that they're low-cost producers, and low-cost producers can compete in an area like ours, where the land price, the lot price, is relatively high compared to the overall house price. We've seen a decline in the number of smaller builders since the Great Recession. There were a lot that just went out of business and never came back since then. So what does that result in? It results in, similar product being built in the area. And then, you're used to seeing this, single family homes that tend to look the same with a little bit different exterior. The middle is, an age restricted villa. Again, the facade may change, but basically the same box. Same thing for the townhouses shown on the right. The good news is they're able to produce it at a relatively low cost, being a production builder. But again, we get some of that sameness in the area. We can move to the next slide. A couple other supply characteristics. We've seen a shift in the last few years from primarily single family detached to more townhome communities. I'm sure you guys have noticed that as well. You know, there again, because that 20 by 40 townhome box is relatively inexpensive to produce, that's what we're seeing a lot of. And it's changed not much over the last 20 years. So this, what you see at the top has been, you know, you've seen it up until recently being built. Again, what's being built in the last couple of years changes the facade a little bit, makes it a little contemporary. We're getting a lot of pressure from the younger folks to get away from the colonial look and get a little more clean line, but that's about as far as we've gone with change in product type. What we haven't seen a lot of, and what you've probably heard some about, and we can go to the next slide, is the whole idea of the missing middle product. And what your upper left is a cottage product that's faced on a village green. The lower left is a 6-plex or an 8-plex product, a duplex on the lower right built on what was formerly a single family detached home. And then just more product in the upper right. We don't see a lot of this in Anne Arundel County. I think it's being more market accepted around the rest of the country, but our current zoning ordinances and subdivision regulations don't make this easy to build or develop in this area. To do the upper left would require zoning variances and subdivision regulation modifications that frankly are risky and time consuming and often don't end up getting approved. So that's why you're not seeing a lot of this. No, I'm not saying that. Sir. Okay. Yeah. Oh, sure. Sure. Some more housing supply characteristics and trends. Not only have prices gone up, like Dan just talked about, but construction costs have increased more over the last 2 years than we've ever seen before, 30 to 40%. Again, prices are up 15 to 20% over the last 2 years, pretty much across the product lines. And number of new home communities we're seeing is down by about 40% in the county. That's a combination of two things. We're seeing more larger communities, but also the pipeline in terms of projects going through the process has decreased in the last 5 years. Just not a lot of new communities are going to be coming online. One thing I want to go back to that I failed to mention in terms of products is the lack of condominiums, which would be the most affordable product. You don't see much of that in this area. And a lot of that has to do with the financial risk associated with it. You're building a big building. FHA requires that you pre-sell a lot before you can close on the units, and you're carrying that asset. And if it's a 50 unit building, you could get caught in a downturn. It's just really risky for a developer to do that. The second thing is just a legal risk. There are firms that will that make their living on going after condominium developers and owners. And again, it's just risky. Hopefully we'll see more of that in the future, because I think that's a needed product type. What I wanted to do before I head on to demand is just give you guys a cost analysis of what it costs leading to the price of what we would consider a starter townhome. A 16 by 40 townhome, 1-car front load garage that you have seen in many communities around here. On the far left are the costs, current costs in 22. The second column 3 years ago. The third column is just the percent change that we've seen in each of those cost categories. The fourth column is a percent of each category as a percent of the total. And then the fifth column is the national average for that percentage. And, you know, a few takeaways from this is obviously sales prices have gone up dramatically and costs have gone up. But if you look at the comparison in our area, typical lot costs is anywhere from 25 to 35% of the overall price of the house. The national average is right around 16 to 17%. So again, this just solidifies my point earlier that we have a high land cost in this area. The second point, fee structure. Again, I'm not making any value judgments here. I'm just drawing a conclusion that our fee structure is about twice the national average. 8% of a home price in Anne Arundel County is comprised of fees versus the national average of about 4.5%. We can go on to the next slide. So switching to what are we seeing in terms of housing demographics or housing demand characteristics and trends? You know, recent trends over the last few years, household sizes are decreasing. And I think that's a national trend as well. We're seeing a lot of single women as buyers. We are seeing fewer children in our communities. The two that we have, the two larger ones that we have going on right now, we're seeing number of children at about 50% of what the Board of Education forecasts for student generation. And that's staying fairly consistent. Again, that's probably mirroring the reduction in the birth rate across the country. We're seeing a lot of ethnic and racial diversity in our communities. And in age-restricted communities, there's a big demand for those, and we're just seeing that it's a more active buyer. And I guess I put that in there because I'm one of those. I'm more active, but so moving on down to housing and community preference trends. What are folks looking for? And not necessarily that we always provide it, but they're looking, especially the younger cohort, looking for a walkable community. Can they walk to restaurants? Can they walk to shopping? Are they close to work? Is there close retail by? Is there fun around for them? Outdoor amenities have become a big deal, primarily since the pandemic. Walking trails, you know, the community fire pit area where folks can gather around. You know, gosh, we're building bike pump tracks now for kids. Just everybody's looking to get outside more. Again, younger cohort, more and more are looking for low maintenance, and that really is the townhome opportunity there. Don't have a lot of time or interest in taking care of a yard or the home itself. There is a high interest in those different product types, that missing middle that I mentioned earlier, but we're not meeting that demand. And even though townhouses we've shifted more and more toward townhouses, I'd be remiss if I didn't say there is still strong demand for folks for single family detached. It's just not as great as it once was, but that has not gone away. And then we look at demand drivers, and you know, you guys, your area, for better or for worse, is sitting right in the middle of the primary demand driver. It's got the largest employer in the state. It's got the largest employment growth in the state. And, you know, that's Fort Meade NSA. And employment in our industry is the primary demand driver. Now, you know, what we've seen in the last 2 months is the demand pool has shrunk. We've seen traffic fall off at our communities because of mortgage rate increases. And so we're seeing demand drop because of that. That doesn't mean that those aren't willing buyers. They simply can't afford that product. And so that leads to the next slide, which is taking a look at that same starter home, that same 16 by 40 starter home, and looking at how affordable it was back in 2019, and that it's at its then market price. And then looking on the left column, what it is in 2022. And this looks at mortgage rates back then, mortgage rates today. And the bottom line is that price mortgage rate combo back in 2019 made that unit affordable to somebody making 82% of the household median income in this county. That same townhome today, you've got to be making 116% of household median income to afford that same house. Next slide. So I'll leave you with what I think my take on the key question that the regional groups are facing, and that is it possible to increase the housing supply in a way that it's environmentally sensitive and compatible with existing neighborhoods and provides what buyers are looking for? I don't have an answer to that. I think I see that as the primary question. And I'm just going to give you a few things that other jurisdictions in the region have done. I don't necessarily agree with all these, but I think the takeaway is we're not the only ones in Anne Arundel County that are facing these issues, and they all come at it from a little bit different angle. A lot are, designate higher density town centers to absorb the majority of new building in a region. That is happening in Glen Burnie. That's like a parole town center that hits that walkability, live near where you play, you eat, you shop. Update zoning and subdivision regulations. So these areas have good design and not just a two-dimensional zoning and subdivision regulation that focuses on setbacks as opposed to good design. Third item, a lot of jurisdictions are updating their zoning and subdivision regulations to promote that missing middle type of product, to make it easier for that to get through the process. And then fourth bullet point, again, this is, I forget which jurisdiction is doing this, but basically they said, you know what, our commercial industrial areas are away from existing neighborhoods. We're going to say you can do residential by right there. And that enabled them to get away from the not in my backyard issue. And then finally, this is just what Fairfax County and Loudoun County did out by Dulles Airport. The Dulles Airport Authority shut down hundreds of acres from development because of their noise zone. And Fairfax and Loudoun County said, good for you, but we're not adhering to it. We're going to let housing be built there, and you can't stop us. And they've done just that. So just a few ideas to toss out if the desire is to increase supply. And with that, turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and for all the volunteer work you do on this important effort. It's really important. I'm Erin Karpowitz. I'm the CEO of Arundel Community Development Services, and ACDS, as we're known, is the county's nonprofit. If you want to go to the next slide, we're the county's nonprofit housing and community development agency. We were privatized back in 1993, so we are able to act as a nonprofit and kind of move and do some innovative things, but we also administer a lot of funding and programming on behalf of Anne Arundel County. I'm not going to go through all the things we do. I'm going to hit on some of them in my presentation, but essentially we're really concerned about serving the low and moderate income communities in our county with both affordable housing opportunities and community development opportunities. I like that, Dan kind of gave us the big 30,000 foot picture of this county and the region. And Karen talked a lot about middle income housing. Really, that's important to support the middle income housing because that helps kind of free up some of the supply so that homes are more affordable for everybody. And that's one of the things that is really great about the Plan 2040. It's really looking at housing and making sure that there's housing available for people at all income levels. I noticed that's one of the goals up on the wall. So that's great. That's kind of my guiding star, and one of my top priorities in our agency is to really focus on how we can create those affordable housing opportunities. We have some, we also do a lot of community grant making. We have over 150 grants out to subrecipients right now, I think. And then we coordinate strategies to end homelessness. And we also build community centers. I didn't have that on my list, but if you've passed by Reese Road and see the big community center coming up, we're the project manager for that in partnership with the county and the local development council. So that's in your area, and we're really excited about it. So anyway, I want to just kind of talk about affordable housing and what it is, because you know, a lot of times folks hear affordable housing or workforce housing and they think there's one definition for it. I'm sorry to say there's not one definition. It really depends on when you're talking about. The industry standard for affordable, generally, I think there's some general consensus around the idea that a housing unit is affordable to a household if that household is not paying more than 30% of their income, their monthly income, towards housing costs, whether it be rent and utilities or PITI, principal, interest, taxes and insurance, and utilities. So that's kind of a general thing, but that could be applicable to someone, a household making $200,000 a year or a household making $30,000 a year. And so, you know, it becomes more critical though, and you become more cost burdened the lower you are on the income range. So when we're talking about affordable housing, though, serving low and moderate income communities, it really, a lot of that depends on providing some subsidized units. And when you're talking about subsidized units, again, it depends on the funding source that is supporting those subsidized units. So for example, typically when we talk about affordable and workforce on units that we're developing with partners, the income limits range from 50% of area median income. So right now in our region, 50% of area median income is about, I think, $54,000 for a family of 3. And that's for the region. We operate with regional numbers because that's what HUD makes us use, not Anne Arundel County specific. And then if you're talking about 120% of area median income, that's really close to $120,000 for a family of 3. And that's kind of what Karen, you know, she was talking about a family making 116%. You would need to make about 116 to 120% of area median income to afford the type of housing that Karen was talking about. The properties that we're working with on the rental side, typically those are limited to people making 60% of area median income and sometimes even lower targeting. And that's, again, dictated by the funding sources that support that, that development. Your next slide. So just to kind of give you an idea of what the needs are in the county, HUD data, we rely on that a lot to be really specific about Anne Arundel County, but it's not great about being out, you know, every year. It relies on census estimates that come out every few years. But we know that things haven't really gotten better. This is mostly 2019 data, and things have only gotten tighter. But as of 2019, about 42% of all renters in the county were cost burdened. That's all renters, regardless of their income. And then also about 80% of renters who earn 50% of area median income, which again is about $52,000 a year for 3 people, they were cost burdened. So the lower down in the income, not surprisingly, the more cost burdened the households are. And then in addition, this is a shocking statistic. Oh, I keep forgetting to update this slide. You would think this is the 3rd time I presented, I would update it. Our housing waiting list for housing commission programs is up to, that's like public housing, Section 8. There are over 31,000 households on that list right now. This was a March number, but I got an update the other day. So the housing needs are great. Again, we rely on a lot of HUD data, but we wanted to really drill down into Anne Arundel County and do a county specific study. In 2019, we hired a consultant who went out and surveyed all of our rental housing, and he also did a homeownership study. And what this slide shows is that about half of the renters at the time who were earning 50% of area median income and below, they didn't have housing that was affordable. We were missing about 8,923 units of housing that would be affordable to that group. So that's just 8,900 units in our county. When you think back to the number that Dan quoted, I think you said about 40,000 in the region. This is 8,900 just in our county, and that's just for people at 50% and below. So that's a lot of missing units. Next next slide. On the homeownership side, we know that the median income or the median sales price is going up. I think it went up just 5% year over year from last year, and it's been a way steady trend for the last decade. And so we know that. And then this is just a little bit more interesting data. When we looked at there's a study that comes out for housing quality standards from the Appraisal Institute. And this looks at, it's kind of a survey of existing units and sales. And it's probably hard to read this, but essentially what this says is that of the units that sold in Anne Arundel County at 320,000, and at the time, 320,000 was the house price that was affordable to a family making 80% of area median income, so about $89,000 a year. At the time, all those houses that were for sale and sold at a price that would be affordable to that group, 90% of them only scored a 3 on a scale of 1 to 9 on a housing quality review. So that the existing ones, you could look at the MLS listings and say, oh, well, look, there's a house out there for sale, that you could afford, but it's not good quality and it needs a lot of work. And those are in our older existing neighborhoods. So, we're not building enough units, and the ones that are out there need a lot of work, and it makes it cost prohibitive to acquire them and put the right, renovations into it to make it a quality unit for our low income families. So what do we do? I really like to help, again, my focus now in creating these opportunities is to how can we support the supply? So our agency provides county funds, and we provide federal home dollars to provide low interest loans to affordable housing developers. And they leverage these funds with other state and federal tax credits and state loan dollars. And so they're producing them, and I'm really excited because we just got 5 properties that were supported in the last year. They're in the pipeline. They're not going to all come out at once, but we're helping them to produce some units. And as you can see, they're just kind of, they're not like what you think, I think what people, my parents' generation thought of as public housing with like big high-rise towers. They're nice quality units that they're part of the fabric of the community. They look nice, they're well-maintained and well managed. So and then homeownership. On the homeownership side, right now we have a lot of more demand side programs like homeownership counseling. It's free for first-time home buyers, regardless of their income. We have down payment and closing cost assistance that we're providing to first-time home buyers who are income limited, so they're making below 80%. It's a great deal. We were offering $20,000, basically grants. We do put a lien on the property, but there's no repayments, no interest, basically $20,000 grants. In the last year, we didn't have anyone use it because they could, like Dan was saying in his intro, they couldn't find the houses that they could afford even with this grant money. And then we also provide foreclosure prevention for struggling homeowners. This is going back to kind of the supply side, like if people have properties that are in bad repair and they meet our income limits, we can do rehab. That's a before on the left and an after on the right. So that's for existing homeowners, but we also were doing some acquisition and rehabilitation. This is in one of our older communities, Brooklyn Park, kind of taking away eyesores from the community, rehabbing them, and then renting them out for affordable prices. Or, there's some thought to go back to try to do a homeownership model. So we could, these would be subsidized in some way with some grant funding or loan funding to make them affordable, to write down the cost for limited income home buyers. Some solutions to increase supply, again, looking at it from my, affordable housing lens that's looking to make housing affordable for the low and moderate income communities. again, continue to support the supply side by investing general funds and our federal home funds and CDBG funds to support developments. Continue to support payment in lieu of taxes, so that gives developers a discount on their operating costs and on their property taxes. So that makes it more affordable or feasible for them to operate those affordable units. And then, possibly reduction in other local fees. Karen mentioned the high cost of impact fees. Right now, affordable housing developers have to pay those same impact fees with a few exceptions, the same way a for-profit or a market rate developer would need to do it. And then, leveraging county surplus property, that's an idea that other jurisdictions have done. I don't think we have a lot of developable surplus property. That's one of the challenges there. And then in land use regulations, some of the things that Karen talked about, I'm not going to go into those as much. And then, thinking about other creative zoning incentives, we have a great, I think it's going to be great, but a workforce housing policy that gives developers some incentives and also some density bonuses for certain areas where they build, and allows them also to build affordable units, affordable and market rate units in commercial and industrial zones. And then similarly, housing for elderly of modest means allows affordable units to be built in commercial districts if it's for older adults of limited income. And then finally, I think, this is something that market rate and affordable housing developers all feel it affects them all, is the adequate public facilities requirements. And I know Steve's going to get into that, so I won't talk about that more, but that's a big barrier for our partners in the affordable housing industry.
The tiny mic.
This is a tiny mic.
Can I say one more thing?
Oh, yeah, that's for $1.
So I apologize. I am going to have to sneak out in a minute, but my colleague Beth Brush, who's our planning director, is here. So she's very knowledgeable and can answer all questions during the discussion.
Well, thank you, Erin. I'm Steve Keizigler. I'm the Planning and Zoning Officer for the county. And for those who don't know me, I've been in this business as long as Karen, or close to it. I think about 34 years, and I'm going to talk about school APF, adequate public facilities, and some data and how it comes together. As I'm coming up, kind of adding cleanup, the idea is that I can probably bring elements of each of the three previous presentations together. And why this is interesting for me, I've had the benefit over my time to work in Queen Anne's County, Hartford, Frederick, Prince George's, Charles, and Anne Arundel County. I'm slowly trying to work my way around to be a planning director in every county in Maryland before I turn 90. But I had a ton of experience working on adequate public facilities ordinances, all of those places. So having that kind of more regional experience, bringing it together for this type of discussion, I think is really helpful. So we're going to talk about the relationship between adequate public facilities for schools and development. So next slide. And we'll just skip to the next. So first is adequate public facilities. And for our purpose tonight, we're going to concentrate on school APF because it affects to such a great degree everything our three presenters were talking about. Our ability to absorb the market share of housing that should be coming into the county that is held up. But there are other versions of adequate public facilities I just want to touch on. Next slide. So adequate public facilities in Anne Arundel County typically are for fire, roads, schools, sewer, and water facilities. We tend to think now of stormwater management as being a part of an APF system. So the county has the responsibility to fund and construct APF in a timely, coordinated manner as accomplished through the Capital Improvement Program, which is a 6-year planning budget document and guided by the General Development Plan. And you've already spent some time understanding the recently adopted Plan 2040, I believe. So it deals with the pace and distribution of development. And one of the key things that we talk about is testing, APF testing. Every one of those main criteria I talked about has a mechanism to test the new proposed use in relation to infrastructure and facilities necessary to support it. So next slide. So one of the things, I think everyone will have access to the presentations, and I'm not going to cover this, but when we talk about APF and the standards, the regulations that go with it, it's a significant component of our regulatory scheme. We're showing you at the top of this slide what sections of the code you can go in and look if you don't have anything better to do, and you want to understand how standards, the utilization chart, wait list, annual report, how all of those things work. But it's a pretty elaborate process, a step-by-step sequential process that one goes through in the testing process to determine whether or not your project is good to go or gets hung up. That's under the standards. The other thing we do is we produce a utilization chart, which is based on forecasting by the Board of Education that our staff plug into a chart. And when I say forecasting by the Board of Ed, on the number of new students that will be in each feeder system, it is not based on actual. And Karen alluded to something that we'll be studying, analyzing a lot harder in the coming months is, are the forecast actual? When you make a forecast 2 or 3 years ago about how many students will be in a school today, well, we know what the forecast was 2 or 3 years ago. Now we know what the actual is, and we can compare and contrast if there are differences or problems. I'm thinking there's going to be some problems. We haven't done that analysis. The utilization chart is so important. It's approved by the county council. It's revised annually, updated May 1st and September 1st. The September 1st date is important because that's when the kids come back to school and there's a physical count. The May date is an estimate as we're closing out the school year. And it deals with projected enrollment, which we just talked about. And the chart would identify all of the feeder systems. And remember, a feeder system is basically one high school, 1 to 2 middle schools that support that high school, and somewhere between 4 and 6 elementary schools that all feed into the middle school, which then feeds into the high school. That is a feeder system. We have 13 of them in the county now. And that chart will show, based on these forecasts, which schools and or feeder systems are open for residential development or closed for residential development. And when we say residential development, what I really mean is subdivision activity. School APF does not regulate building permits. It regulates the subdivision process, how many new lots can be created in a particular area. It's equally important because if someone's intending to subdivide land to create a residential building lot, they're expecting to have access to a building permit in the relatively near future. There's also a scenario where we have a wait list. Developers can still propose development applications in closed feeder systems. They just can't get approved, and if you want to say implemented, they go on a wait list up to 6 years. Why do we have a 6-year wait list? Because that's how long our capital improvement program is for. The idea is that if we have projects in a closed school system or feeder system, the county has 6 years to come up with a plan, a way to add capacity, or for the Board of Ed to redistrict, which almost never happens, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And then we produce an annual report, number, type of dwelling units approved, number, type of dwelling units on the wait list, and it's sent to the Board of Ed, County Executive Planning Advisory Board. It's a very formal process that this goes through. Next, please. So there are instances where for school APF, testing is not required. Essentially, certain types of residential projects can be exempt. And an example would be a non-residential development, commercial industrial uses. They don't produce any school kids, so why would they be subject to school APF? Housing for the elderly of moderate means. Age restricted, meaning 55 years and older that come with covenants restricting who can live in these type of units. Residential subdivisions, certain types of agriculture preservation subdivisions, and dwelling units as an accessory use in commercial districts. Those are all basically exempt from school testing. There's another one. For no more than 5 lots, single family detached dwellings, or no more than 5 dwelling units, if the property is owned for a minimum of 3 years, those would be exempt, but they have an agreement with the county. And those are situations where it's typically a family subdivision. There's a mom and dad, and they want to subdivide a couple lots off for their kids somewhere down the line. This doesn't happen very much. It's a bit of a way out for our small developers, or I'm going to say family planners doing estate planning. In the Pearl Town Center, Odenton Growth Management Area, Mead Village, Glen Burnie Sustainable Community Overlay Area or Transit Orient Overlay Development Policy areas identified in the GDP can also be exempt from school APF. The idea is that in our more intensely developed areas, we want to see a higher intensity residential use. In certain projects, you know that in the parole area in particular, it is growing very, very fast now. We've got about a half dozen big mixed use projects heading down Riva Road. And when completed, it will almost double the size of Annapolis or Parole Town Center. The residential components that are proposed within those developments will be exempt. And that was by design when the parole plan was adopted 30 years ago. And the last is funded in part by low income tax credits. Next, please. So let's talk a little bit about what these feeder systems are. Are we comfortable now with what that terminology is and what it means? Okay, next, please. So I want to start with the map on the right. And that shows every single feeder system in the county. Each is represented by a different color. And what that means is in each one of those, there is a high school, at least one middle school, and some number of elementary schools. And feeder system, as we discussed, is meant to describe a geographic area with different types of schools, all that feed from the lowest level elementary up to the high school. Then you look at the map on the left, and you see a bunch of red in certain feeder systems, right? Those are feeder systems currently closed to new residential subdivision activity. So I think there's 6 in there. So we have 13 feeder systems. 6 of the county's feeder systems are closed to residential development. Some in places that we really would like to see more residential development, particularly workforce or affordable housing. I just wanted to show you the difference between where the feeder systems are and at today's rate, or how the assessment goes today, there's a significant part of the county that shut down to new residential subdivision activity. And we'll talk about what this means a little bit further. Next. So I neglected to tell you that the county has undertaken a pretty elaborate APF schools work group. Some members in this room are in that or very involved. We've been working on this process for about 20 months. I guess I was lucky because I got tasked to lead that. And we've been working our way through basically developing information and data that will allow us in the future to make better decisions in relation to residential housing, residential subdivision, and the impact on public schools. And we're at the point where the group has 3 different options to choose from in making a recommendation to the administration and ultimately to the county council. But it's pretty radical. So next. So new homes versus building permits. Why is this important? Everyone knows that new building permits are causing school overcrowding, right? That's what everyone says to me. That's the only reason we have school overcrowding is because of new growth. What I would tell you that permits for new construction is a small part of the school APF picture. Existing residential home sales far outweigh permits issued for new construction over the last 20 years. And these numbers are kind of staggering. When we think about, again, I've been in this for 34 years, and wherever I've worked, everyone is upset with the outrageous rate of new growth and its impact on the public school system. And I have always said that is not a major influencer. It is a minor influencer overall. So next slide. This is a fabulous little piece of information. What this does is show from 2001 to 2020, a comparison with building permit activity and existing home sales not related to the new building permit. And if you go back and you look in 2001, the ratio of new building permits to existing home sales was not that different. 3,200 building permits versus 4,250 existing home sales. But look at how that information evolves over 20 years. Over the last, it's been growing exponentially that existing home sales far exceed new building permit activity. to the point over the last few years, for every new building permit that is issued, there is 6, on average, 6 existing home sales not related to those new building permits. I would argue at a minimum, there is no difference between the number of public school students produced between a new building permit and an existing home sale. Karen might have a slightly different version, but that's another area that we want to study. But there is functionally, at a minimum, no difference. So the reality is, where kids come from that enter the public school system, 85% of those kids are coming out of an existing home sale, and it has nothing to do with a new building permit. We think that's hugely important because from a school APF standpoint, we are over-regulating one part of the industry, which is building permit activity, and we're not regulating at all where most of the influences are coming from, which is existing home sales. Okay. Does that make sense, everybody? That's an important slide. This is probably more important. And this is where we're dealing with vacant seats. So between, again, we took a 20-year time period, 2002, 2021. We've had an average of over 11,000 vacant or open seats in the public school system. Comparing total enrollment, state rated capacity from 2002 to 2021, we've had 11,243 vacant seats. So when you look at the chart here and you see from 2002 to 2021, there's 3 categories. The actual enrollment, not forecast, this is actual. Then we have the state rated capacity, which is a number that the state applies to all of our schools. And then we have the difference between the two. And you look at the vacant seat, the difference equals vacant seat, the far column on the right, and look at those numbers of vacant seats that we have been carrying for 20 years. We've been building a ton of school capacity that was not needed because we didn't understand or know this information. To give you some perspective, if you look at the rated capacity in the year 2003, it's 83,455. That's what the state said we had for student seats. And you look at the actual enrollment for 2020. I'm not going to use 2021 because it's a false number because of COVID. But 2020, we had 83,044. What's interesting is we had enough seats in the county system in 2003 for the number of kids in the public school system today. My math says we've spent well over $1 billion in unnecessary school capacity. I think the APF work group is getting this. I think the Board of Education is reluctantly getting this. They don't like it because it doesn't look good. I know the county administration and certain members of the county council are starting to understand this. And this is the joy of using information and data to help make better informed decisions in the future. So I wanted to show, there's some other chart, slide information on the far right. I won't go through it, but I think you get the gist of it. We've got a problem today in the number of vacant seats, but it's not a new problem. My guess is if we went back another 20 years, we would see similar trends. And the major reason we're seeing this is Anne Arundel County seems to have a more difficult time redistricting than anywhere else I've worked or anywhere else I've heard. Instead of balancing enrollment between feeder systems or schools within one feeder system, we have chosen to either add seats to a school or build new schools. And we've done it for a long, long time. And when you think about the issues that we're having with, do we have an obligation to accommodate our proportional fair share of regional housing growth? And as planners, we tend to think you do. This is the single biggest thing that the county can do to make reasonable adjustments. We'll never reach our targeted housing needs until this gets tackled. And hopefully we're in a better position to bring this forward. It's probably not going to be coming forward in a meaningful way before an election, but hopefully we're going to have this teed up for elected officials to be able to deal with when there's a new council that comes in. And I hope this was interesting and informative, but my guess is none of you thought we've been sitting on this glut of vacant seats for this long. I've heard all kinds of stories about an individual school that is at 120% capacity. It might be an elementary school. And then I look at the 4 elementary schools that surround it, that 2 of them are less than half a mile away and they're at 70% capacity. I think that's criminal that we're unable to balance enrollment. And balancing enrollment means we don't have to build as many new seats. I'm not suggesting we do anything with the Board of Ed's capital money other than put it into modernization so that all of the schools are more equal than they are today. So I just have a quick second as findings. Go to the last one. Real estate stock composition. And this is related to everything I think you've heard before. Housing stock, well, in 2020, most residential properties were single family. Single family attached homes, typically what you think of as townhomes, are about 20%, and multifamily units make up 17% of the housing units. The percentages for all of those have not radically changed in 20 years. So those trends continue to this day. In a real estate sense of owning versus renting, a majority of residential property is still owner occupied. Rental units represent about 24% of total housing stock. That's been consistent for about 20 years. School enrollment, utilization, school waiting lists. Multiple feeder systems remain closed to new development. Between 2003 and 2020, 3 feeder system districts were closed to new development 70% of the time. And most 7 feeder districts were closed at least 50% of the time. Let's go student enrollment, real estate outliers. Chesapeake High School is a high school that is underutilized. One of the reasons, as I understand it, it occurred many years ago, long before most of us were involved in this, but there was a decision to build a high school. There was a lot of land surrounding that area that was zoned for residential development. The people that were there were upset about that, and they convinced the then county council to acquire the land and make parks. So we had a school that didn't have any land zoned to produce kids. That remains to this day. So I'm sharing just that's an outlier how this works, but I think at the end of the day, the reality is we have a lot of unused capacity in the public school system, and at some point we got to stop continuing that trend. So thank you.
You can transition to the Q&A now. I might encourage people to take 30 seconds to stretch or stand up or whatever. We have 10 for SAC members. We also have printouts of medical vocabulary, the missing middle guide, and copy specific information too. So we got copies. I have that, and Keisha, hand it over back to you. All right, so we're open for Q&A. If you want to pick us off, I have a question about the topic. Can you kind of identify and zero in on what part or what district they were region? You have a majority of those.
It's not one region, it's countywide.
Okay, so for district 2, you kind of identify.
No, and so yeah, that's actually a very good question, and there isn't an easy way to answer it because region district boundaries do not match up even remotely with school district feeder systems. They're not, you can't correlate one to the other because they're different geographic areas. So I wouldn't know how to answer that. What I would say is that the vacant seats are spread. I'm going to say that's something we can provide for you after the fact, but they're all over. There's so many seats, they're all over the place. But I can't correlate it easily to a region district.
Can you kind of get at it?
Not off the top of my head, and not without doing some analysis, which we may have a capacity issue in the near term. I don't know, and I didn't do that before. I didn't have the time to put that together. So they're just you can't correlate. It's your region area may have, and I just don't know off the top of my head, 2 or 3 partial feeder systems.
No, we only have one. That's it.
Okay, I can provide you, just not tonight, but we can.
Just a reminder for SAC, please remember to say your name before you start speaking, just so when we have the recording, we know who's talking. Thank you.
But you have portions of other feeder systems in this region. It's not just one, it's not Mead.
No.
But the entirety of Mead is, so that would be a
We can at
beneficial.
least show you that. I'm happy to provide it. I just don't know it off the top of my head. Okay.
You could get kind of a basic sense from that the map of closed districts, right? Like if this is open, that means all the schools.
Unless the meat feeder system marries up exactly with the geography of this region, it's a false number. But I can, if Meade is 2/3 of the geography of this region, we can at least show you that. We debated this before we started this presentation, and then it wasn't as easy to do as you think.
Marilyn Florelli, would it be possible to provide at least for the map that you had up there that showed this side of the county where Region 2 is, showed nothing closed, but in reality, there are a number of schools closed in those areas. Would you be able to?
Yeah, we will. We can. And let me say, when a feeder system closes, what it really means is that the high school is closed. And if the high school is open, if there is one middle school, and if that is closed, that is enough to close the whole feeder system. Marilee's right. You could have a high school that's open and middle school that's open, and you could have 5 elementary schools, and four of the five may be closed, but the whole feeder system is open. But you're limited with what you can do in the elementary side of it. This is a little bit like a black box, so trying to describe it is awkward sometimes. I think the main thing that I'm trying to get across is there's no reason for any schools, not one school in Anne Arundel County, to be closed. And we've had 50, 60, 70% of the feeder systems in the county closed over the last 20 years. We've had seats for every kid.
We've all lived here for quite some time. I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, so I'm very well aware of the elementary situation in the Laurel area. That has gone on for that period of time. I have 30-year-olds, so I've lived through that, as you well know. So the issue right now that we're facing is the elementary issue. And the issue that some of our neighbors that we represent is that there's the land that the Board of Ed has had for 25 years that they were saying to the neighbors that they were going to build a school on, that they haven't done so. Same thing behind Jessup Elementary. They rebuilt Jessup Elementary, and there's land for an additional school that they said they were going to build on, and they didn't do it. So that's what everybody is all up in arms about. And we're aware that there's plenty of openings in South County, like you said, plenty. And the redistricting in South County is great, but that's not going to help us out here. And when Crofton High School was built, they did do some redistricting with Arundel and what have you, but that didn't alleviate anything that we're experiencing here in Region 2. And with Old Mill coming, again, the redistricting that's going to go on with that is not necessarily going to help us. And we are Region 2, which is basically, we have Meade High, Meade Middle, MacArthur, and then the elementary school, Rockbridge, Maryland City, and Monarch. That's all we have in Region 2.
I think, and again, where I would approach it from the standpoint is when you refuse to redistrict ever, unless a new school is built, you end up in situations like I think you're talking about, where why aren't we building a new school? And my perspective would be, why would we build a new school when of the 11, 12,000 vacant seats, half of them are with elementary schools, and every single elementary school that's over capacity has at least one elementary school next to it that is well under capacity. The balancing of enrollment, it just doesn't happen. So you end up with situations where you got one school that's 120% and 3 schools right next to it at 70%. You don't need to build a new school to solve the 120%. You need to adjust the boundaries between those 4 elementary schools, and they're not good at it. They don't want to do it because people you get it. I've got a kid. Nobody wants to see their kid go to the school you don't want to see your kid go to. But the end result is we're sitting on this glut. We spent, hundreds of millions of dollars creating a system that's completely dysfunctional and frankly, very difficult to defend legally if ever challenged. I will tell you this, in Montgomery County, they have a school system, a little bit bigger than twice the size of the total school. They have got their seats equal students balanced roughly 1,000 up, 1,000 down every year. Every year. They know, money's precious, and they work very hard to make sure that they balance enrollment and use their assets wiser than we have in the past. I don't know of any jurisdiction who has numbers as gross as ours, these 10, 12, 13, 14,000 every year. I don't know anybody who does that.
Being so isolated as we are, as far west as we are, in terms of the district, we can't bus our kids to South County.
What I'm saying is, it isn't South. There are schools, and what I will do is I'll send in. Maybe I'll come back and we'll talk about it another time. But the school utilization chart. When you see the numbers, the percentages, open, closed, it isn't. I don't think anybody would be talking about sending your kids, from me down to South County. That isn't going to make any sense. What I'm saying is seats are all over the place.
If you could send that for us.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Sure. And we have maps prepared that show some of this if that's helpful. So we can certainly do that.
So just to add, right now you do have access to the educational facilities master plan, which would have last year's data. And it sounds like the update comes on September 1st.
They need, but they really need to see is the school APF work group data as opposed to just the master plan from the board. That we use their information, but we share it differently.
Sorry about that. Thank you, though. Okay, my next question is actually in reference to Elm Street communities. So I thought it was interesting that you kind of cited a little bit of statistics about, individuals who are single women kind of populating in our region, right? So you guys are developing townhomes, which is admirable. The question is the price point for the townhomes. And I understand there's like the cost for the land that you said is kind of high, as well as, construction costs, permitting costs. I understand that. You mentioned there's a 16 by 40 starter home. Do you all have in the plans for developing anything that's, I guess, let's say maybe smaller or more affordable for individuals who are single young professionals to be able to afford it, make it more affordable?
I think that product is in that missing middle. I think it's also in a condo. I think you're probably going to see some of those come online. Something certainly at this stage of the market, we're seeing builders say, instead of a 16 by 40, how about a 16 by 36? And it does reduce the cost. And so, yeah, at this stage in the market, when mortgage rates are up and affordability becomes even more of an issue, and prices have increased by what they've increased the last 2 years, you're going to start to see some help.
I'm just kind of curious to kind of hear your thoughts around, like, what is the logic behind thinking that condominiums are more affordable? Because those often come with condo fees. HOAs are expensive, but condo fees always escalate.
You build a smaller unit, right? So you can, if you're desiring a for sale product, you can, 1,150 square foot, 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo is affordable. That's going to be in the 200s, even when you lay condo fees on top of that. It's going to be more affordable than 16 by 40 town. Certainly there are issues with condominiums, and we've seen older condominiums in the area not have sufficient reserves to deteriorate over time, and that's the other legal risk for an owner, for sure. You need the right management, but just total dollars, it's a smaller unit, and even with the condo fees can be more affordable.
There's more units on the same amount of land.
It is, that's right. So your per unit price for the land is.
I'm actually the president of a condominium board, and I lived in a condominium a little over 20-something years, and it was just like for women like me, professional single women, and at the time there was the buy down market. So you see a lot of single professional women. So even though, yes, the cost may be a little more with the condo fees, there's also a social element that you're going to get there because you're going to meet a lot of other people in your situation who are young couples, young single women. So that's one thing I think some people sometimes don't take into account with home ownership is the type of peers you're going to have. So you will meet other people who are like you or in your situation. Maybe not everybody wants to live near children or in around a lot of families or the big houses. And you might find that certain housing products may be a little too much for you because then they'll come with the maintenance. So I think that's one thing people also have to look at with the development is that maybe why some groups don't own houses because some cultures have multi-generational housing cultures. So, but a condo is a good, I guess, starter home, but there's a lot of social things also involved in that.
Yeah, in our Paddock Point project in Howard County, we have what are called 2-over-2 townhome style. They're condominiums, but it's one unit stacked on top of another unit. And the prices, Howard County has a moderate income housing program, which we are have a part of. We have about 15% of all of our units are dedicated to that, and that those units are targeted to people at about 80% of the average median income. And so, but between those, our market rate products were priced in the basically the high 300s, and depending on the unit type, and prices have gone up in the last couple of years significantly. So more recently, the bigger units are close to 500,000 for those 2-over-2s.
I have one question. Of course, it's for the lady that left the room, but I know Beth is here as well. And if she can't answer, this is Jim Kraft. I was just curious that of the 5 new projects that are going through the pilot program, how many of those are utilizing some of the newer flexible zoning that's in the county today in terms of more affordable units? Thank you.
Another. So how long period does it take you guys to have a plan? Actually, part of the construction team, but I would say, and then we acquire on it for like 8 months to start. And we don't do a lot during the year. And we're using properties and
And I'll add to that because I was talking with Erin beforehand. She just mentioned an example of Brooklyn Park. They've been working on, and the cost of just not acquisition, but just updating everybody is $300,000. So it's in today's world, it's an expensive undertaking, and it's worthwhile, but you've got to find subsidies to help with that. That's that plus the original cost of the house isn't affordable to somebody making 50 to 80%.
And these properties are because of the cost. you know, we do. Use these.
I just wanted to follow up. I did a little bit of checking just on the school utilization chart, and it's interesting because I'm looking at Mead. Just to give you some perspective, you have in the high school about 126 vacant seats. You're at about 95% capacity. In the middle schools, you've got MacArthur, which is only at 61%, and Mead Middle is at 85%. You have a ton of capacity in the middle school, in between the two, almost 700 seats between the two middle schools. And then in the elementary schools, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You got 9 elementary schools, and you have 3 of them that are closed now because they're over capacity. But in your elementary school system, you've got about 700 vacant seats, and you've got situations where one of your Maryland cities at 111%. And Manor View is at 54%. You've got Severn Oaks at 72%, then Oakland 68%. And this is the part where when I think about having 9 elementary schools and having the difference in capacity of 111% versus 54%, I'm having to. How does this happen? There is a refusal.
And so that's the issue is people are constantly having to get moved out of MacArthur onto Mead because it's behind the gates. So that's the issue with some of the elementary schools as well. They're all Mead proper. And so you can't necessarily bus kids onto the gates who don't live on base.
What would that be interesting to analyze? What percentage is Van Bokelin on the base? It's not. Okay, but and Maryland City is not. So let's just use Maryland City and Van Bokelin. There is about a 40% difference in capacity between the schools.
Van Bokelin is right here. Maryland City is.
So it's not. When I say about it's this redistrict, it's not as though you have to take students from Maryland City and bring them here. It's about balancing the geographic areas of all of the areas to better balance enrollment. And this is an example. There's no reason for any elementary schools to be closed. There just isn't. Even if you remove the schools in Fort Meade, there won't be a reason. But we can't seem to do that. So we talk about building more schools. Of the 11,000 vacant seats, roughly 1/10 of them are in the Meade system. And we're talking about building new schools. I have a hard time with that concept. And I'm hoping over time more people do too. We have limited funds, and I would love to spend whatever we were going to spend on a new school in the Meade system, modernizing all of these schools so that every one was as good as the other. But, you know, we can. Well, the problem is the majority, and I don't want to take away, but.
Oh, I know. I mean, a lady who served on the board of it, I spent hours and hours on this stuff. So.
This is, for a county government, this is the single biggest political issue council members and an elected board of ed will have to deal with. And it's going to need to happen with a new high school. They're going to have to redistrict a lot of the county, but I'm afraid they're going to try and, play it down and do the minimum they can. But there is, yep. But there's no reason that we should have schools over capacity.
And the issue with MacArthur, if they would just move the gates, so we wouldn't have this issue with meeting MacArthur middle schools. That's the issue, is that parents who can't access this, because they don't have DoD access, get moved to meet middle school.
But these are county funded, built, operated schools.
Correct, these are not DoD schools. But if parents don't have access, DoD access.
Okay.
And they complain, then they get moved to.
Okay.
All they have to do is move the gate.
Oh, you've raised a valuable point. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Laws. Mark, my question is for you. As a developer, also develops in Howard County. Your lessons in Howard County specific to moderate income dwelling units that county can learn from and pick up in practice, whether density bonuses, cost, providing them, anything like that that can be encouraged over here.
That's a good question. I think there's a couple of there for our specific project, there were not density bonuses. So we had a certain allocation of units that came through in our zoning, and 15% of that total allocation was designated for moderate income housing. So in essence, it wasn't, you've got 1,200 units or, to add to that bonus. I think a couple of things that need to be looked at would probably be also considering fee in lieu, having a flexibility of a fee in lieu program. And I'm not that intimately familiar with that component of it, but I think, many types of programs, there's these types of programs all over the country. So looking at various other jurisdictions is a really good thing to do, because there's a lot of lessons learned. And also just being able to have the flexibility to work within various components of the programs, I think is an important characteristic of it. So since I have the mic, can I ask a question? Not of myself. This is all great. Thank you all very much for this presentation. And I guess maybe this is directed at Steve, but I would open it up to any of the panelists. Given our task with coming up with a region plan, all of the great information and illustrating the challenges that we have in the housing arena, many of these things are national trends, state trends, and countywide. I guess if there's things that you could see this group focusing in on for our specific region, I'd be interested in any perspectives or thoughts on that. And are there things that can be done within a regional plan to address the housing supply or lack of shortage?
Requiring information, knowledge, data, which allows you to make more informed recommendations, have the planning process in full, because I doubt anybody in here would consider that at least 10,000 vacancies. It's not a one-time school event. I would hope that that was important to you in making recommendations, through your planning process on interaction with land use and order practices. I would say that you are going to be working on recommending potential land use changes, perhaps code changes that would make it easier for some of the housing types we talked about coming forward. I would say you're going to be making recommendations on zoning. You're going to produce a plan. You're going to have significant planning recommendations. You're going to have regulatory recommendations. And you're going to go through a comprehensive rezoning process. And part of that's going to be how you see how we're zoned currently. When I should start with how we are current land use in the county. That's a mapping process that grows up to zoning over time. But land use and zoning recommendations, because at some point you're going to have a comprehensive rezoning process to participate, and you're going to get a whole bunch of requests from development interests and others to change what they do on their land use zoning. And we're hoping that this group can provide powerful recommendations. Hopefully that you're thinking alike on this, and that they will be well received by the county council who makes these decisions. So I think the zoning side, I think making recommendations on APF, it's fine, it's great. And that's what you guys are all put here for. We know you're not writing the plan, you're not the authors, but you're providing significant insight, recommendation, guidance, and the more information you have, the better it is for how you think about these things. Sort of one way to begin.
Marilee, for the group, can you explain to us how the Board of Ed functions, with the whole system and what can be done?
This is a question for Dan, right?
For you, what you would recommend?
I'm not sure I know how to do that. They have planning and facility people. They have demographers. They have versions of a black box that deals with modeling and forecasting. We're concerned about the outputs that come from that, so we're going to do the paperwork on our own with the raw data. I think one of the things I haven't done the analysis. I think you've done a version of it, but we think that they have forecasted amounts of future student enrollment that does not comport well with actual, which means we're using a model, a future model, to determine what schools are open, not actuals. If you use actuals, it's great for the moment, but it doesn't take into account the future. And what a lot of jurisdictions are doing, they're doing fuzzy boundaries. And that's kind of what I'm trying to go with school group that allows more flexibility. But but you basically have staff evaluating information internally, and it's there's no way, there hasn't been good ways to check it. I think they massage it to a degree, but I don't want to accuse them of that. But they have their own system, and they have a different set of obligations. I think they see it. They're not about trying to accommodate, regional housing. I think they're about building schools because they have people who are employed to build schools. I think they are trying to protect communities. And if they can use school APF to limit growth in a particular area, okay. I think one of the most important things is we now have an elected school board. And who do elected people represent? Their constituents. And most people don't raise their hand and say, when can I have some more residential development in my area? We just need more because it's fun. People don't do that. And I'm sure that they have a different set of influencers. I think they're protecting their assets, and we're trying to be good community planners and accommodate, a growing population.
I was saying earlier that Steve hit the nail on the head that you're not going to change how the Board of Ed operates, but it's incumbent upon the county, who's the funder of these capital projects, to do their own due diligence on the forecasts. And that's being done now. It hasn't been done in the last year, and that's sort of where it got off the ground.
Yeah.
I could just one general. I showed these slides about how this is a big national problem, and it's such an intractable national problem because it really all comes down to groups like this all around the country. It's not the Biden administration just announced this spring they've recognized that the part of fighting inflation, housing costs going up so much, it's contributing to this inflation that everyone's experiencing. And so all they can do though is they want to provide incentives for local governments like Anne Arundel County to help increase the supply of housing. So as Steve said, it's the traditional trend is people get their house and then say, okay, great, no, not the last one. but to the extent that groups like this say, you know what, we want a different kind of community. We do want homes our kids are going to be able to afford. We do want communities that are walkable. To the extent that you say this is what we do want, that's what's going. You folks actually do have the power really to in looking at zoning and putting a little pressure on the school board to balance things out, to allow some of this pressure to ease a little.
I'm curious what some interesting factor that you pulled from this presentation, from these presentations, and any direction that you might be leading as far as suggested changes, housing that you might want to start seeing in Region 2.
Mark mentioned very much sure that the process he went through in Howard County to get his project was extremely simpler than the red tape he had to go through here. And I'm curious to see if that is limiting some of these missing middle projects from occurring. And is that a permitting process? Is that a zoning and planning issue? What is limiting these type of projects from occurring? Is it a grant funding finance issue? Is it a permitting issue? Is it a zoning issue? What is it? He mentioned that this project was easier to do in Howard County, and to get it done in Anne Arundel County would be a pain in the butt. He said that. And I'm curious. Oh, you said something to that effect, that it was easier to do that there.
Take a stab at the missing middle. And I didn't go into this in my presentation, but it should have been part of it. And that is, the missing middle on this, in the product that you saw up there that looks good and is in demand is not something that these production builders built. And so it's going to have to be built by a smaller builder on a smaller scale, which means, yes, the process has to be easier here. Not as time consuming, not expensive. And there's probably going to have to be some incentive tax or impact fee or connection fee incentive to make it cost effective for these one-off projects to happen. And so you really did hit the nail on the head that for you to get that missing middle affordable housing, the process has got to be.
For your projects that you all do, Elm Street, you have a good chunk of projects up here in the Jessup area. Do you and you have the entire watershed community that's going on with $700,000 townhomes that are selling for more than single families in Russet down the street. Do you have 15% or a certain percentage going to?
No, that's a Howard County requirement. That's a Montgomery County requirement. It's been talked about here in Anne Arundel, but it has not been implemented.
We have.
So my question to you now is going to be, why not?
Well, we have had an NPDU work group. I know Christina. Yes, I'm sorry. And there was a whole group with lots of people involved when I first came to the county, and it met for maybe a year and a half, and it seems to have fizzled out.
Yeah, we got to real version of that. Hi, Christina Papa. So when I went to the county in fall of 2019, that group had convened and they were talking about it. Anytime you create new policy that ends up becoming legislation, there are many decision points that you have to decide on. For instance, Mark said in Howard County, the requirement is 15%. That's something you're going to argue about as you are making recommendations on what legislation should be. Can the developers in Anne Arundel County afford 15%? With that, if they can't afford it, is that going to close housing down? So you're trying to find that balance. But there are many points that you have to get agreement on a group that contains lots of people that are bringing their perspective. And when the pandemic happened, the effort got derailed and we never reconvened. And I don't know if that's because it became apparent that there wasn't going to be a political will to move it forward. I really don't know, because it fizzled and we stopped talking about it. But it is one potential piece of a puzzle for being able to bring moderately priced housing supply.
I was on that task force and we got to this point, if I recall correctly, we got to the point of draft legislation. So, you know, it didn't go anywhere. Like Christine said, because of the pandemic, but it has been talked about. It wouldn't surprise me.
So could that, coming out of this group, if that's, because like personally, I have no problem with waiving impact fees and tax incentives and what have you, if 15% of the dwelling units or in a single family community, like a townhome, 15% of units, or in a single family community, X percentage went to MDUs.
That is one of the strategies from page 340 that we highlighted for you to consider. I don't know, I'm probably speaking beyond my bridges here, but like, I don't know what the rules are for implementing something like that. But
no, a recommendation coming out of our region.
You could make the recommendation through the region, but it would be applied countywide or by policy. So there's
well,
no
because of that new legislation that affects my region from the county council bill that we were all up in arms about, that greatly affects my region now. Because of that 5-mile radius of the base, blah, 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 blah. So all this, you know, more density is going to come here to tack that onto it, that, okay, fine, you can have this and this, but 15% of the units have to go to moderately income.
compelling creative. We have a lot of
Which is why we wanted them to wait to vote on it until more input could be had, but such is life.
So that legislation got passed.
Right.
And voted in time. But let's say this group makes additional recommendations. That legislation over time can get fine-tuned.
Absolutely, that's my point.
I mean, yeah, all legislation does. So don't feel like you can go back and revisit that and try to approve it with recommendations that this group is going to make.
That was my point.
I have a comment from Nicole, from Shara, sorry. Shara texted me to ask us. She would like to have some more attention on the topic of home ownership for particularly low income renters or people who would like to transition from renting into home ownership. She stated that she heard from the presentation that the $20,000 grants were not even enough to help people purchase houses, and she wants to know what can be done to break the cycle to allow to help get people from renting into affordable home ownership. She wants to highlight specifically the need for the type of program and support for younger generations, minorities, people of color, specifically Hispanics and African Americans. And she wants to know what resources can be directed to diversify housing and access to housing in regions. So
I think that's more for the other question.
and is that something that you can respond to, or should we follow up with Aaron with the homeownership?
I know our homeownership programs, and you know, she's welcome to. I mean, we have a lot of resources for low to moderate income homeowners in ACDS. So if she wanted to contact us specifically about our programs, you know, she's more than welcome to. I think the 20,000 is a market issue. And we struggle with that and talk about that all the time, like in our meetings on how to make these programs more effective. And, you know, the amounts have gone up and down over time in terms of how much we've provided in subsidy. I think 20,000 is one of the higher range, but it's, yeah, I'm not sure what to do about the market at this point. But definitely she's more than welcome to look online on our website for programs and contact the agency, and people will connect her to first-time home buyers. And I do have to say, is we spend a lot of time marketing our programs and have been pretty successful at marketing our programs to minority communities and to, in general, low income. But we do a lot of fairs and go out to churches and things to make people aware of these programs, to make sure that it's reaching folks. But
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Because we are as a region trying to, a metropolitan area, trying to tackle racial homeownership gaps. And it is hard. I think Howard County goes up to 40,000 in down payment assistance. And I thought you guys raised it, but okay. It's hard, but yeah, but even that is not, and there's so that's one place, kind of more incentives. Although, that can kind of help bid up the price of housing too, so really without getting at the supply issue, it's really, and that's kind of obviously a macro thing. That's not going to help an individual person now who's trying to become a homeowner, but it really is, that combined with more robust assistance to help people buy a home. We are also looking, I work with all the public housing authorities in the region, including the Housing Commission of Arundel County, and we are working to expand the Housing Choice Voucher homeownership program. That's something that housing authorities just haven't paid that much attention to recently, but from talking again to the housing counselors around the region, what we found is that using your housing voucher, which is usually used for rental housing, but there is a program for people who can do it to use that towards a mortgage for 15 years. And apparently I had thought it sort of got a bad rap, but the more you look into it, it actually works really well, including Anne Arundel County has great examples of housing choice voucher holders who bought a house and built a lot of equity that way. So, in the 20th century, there was a lot of federal financial assistance to white people only to become homeowners. That's the genesis of that huge racial homeownership gap, is huge federal subsidies helping white people go directly from public housing in the mid 20th century to wealth building homeownership in a brand new house in the suburbs. Anyway, we're looking more into how can the housing choice voucher program help boost homeownership, and then then that voucher after 15 years can be used for somebody else too. It's a way to kind of serve more people over time too.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Any other questions? Any comments? No? Okay, should we move forward to our activity now or take a break?
Let's take a break, and why don't, just a reminder, folks from the SAC can use some of the time to take a look at the strategy. I personally don't know that we have enough time to get fully through the activity, but I do think you have some time to communicate ones verbally important to you or add some follow-up questions based on the conversation today. And then we can evaluate where and when like dig deeper into some of the questions. So let's keep it great.
And we will have the Office of Planning and Zoning get back to us. We've all had a chance to kind of take a look at some of the strategies and priorities around them and make comments. So we'll be revisiting that again. So now we'll transition to the public comment section. So does anybody at this time in the public have anything that they'd like to contribute? Anyone? Oh, okay. All right. So if we don't have any public comments, then we'll move forward. I think we have some closing remarks in terms of like activities that are going to be going forward. Take a quick look at those.
We're all looking for you guys see that right now. Well, while we're waiting for the flight to come up, so August is great for us. So the walk and roll draft plan, there's gonna be two public meetings about that. The first is gonna be on August 17th. The second will be on August 31st. These are virtual meetings. There you go. And we will follow up with you all tomorrow in the SAC about how to register for attending those if you're interested, registering with Office of Transportation. On August 18th, we'll have our next Region 2 meeting. That meeting is going to broadly address public health and community health. And so we'll be joined by the Department of Recreation and Parks, talk about park equity, the Department of Aging and Disabilities to address things like housing for seniors. We can build on some conversation today for that. And then the Department of Health is going to address a broad range of stuff, including like food access and security, as well as some like actual physical health outcomes. And I'm looking forward to September. That meeting for the SAC, we will be joined by Arundel from Maryland Live. This is a request that was made to us after the economy meeting. So this will be follow-up on economic development in Region 2 with those folks. And we don't have a full agenda yet, so we'll provide that to you. And as far as next up from this meeting, we have a good list of action items going, including someone asked about the training topics for Plan 2040. We're going to get the information from Steve from School APF Utilization Charts. We also had some, what was that? I think that's adding the presentations to that. So regarding the strategies and everything that are here, thank you for those who have commented. It's not too late if you're on your way out your door after this. If you want to add a question or comment, thank you. Mark and I will continue to research the ones that have been most heavily favored by the dots. Those are the ones that we'll make a priority to follow up with you about in the next couple of weeks. I think that's it from us. Unless you want to make the next great.
All right. Okay. All right. So everyone, this concludes our meeting. So do I have a motion to adjourn? All right, Nicole, thank you. All right. We've got several. Hearing no opposition, then we are adjourned. Thank you. Have a good night.